Even the atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, says historically it's indisputable that Jesus was dead. So Jesus was dead.
Oh my God! An atheist said that Jesus was real and that he really died? I guess I have to change my mind then. Do you see how weak these arguments are? In this video, I plan to strike right at the heart of Christian theism. Yes, in this video, I'm going after Jesus and his alleged resurrection. I believe it was St. Paul who said that if Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain. So it turns out St. Paul and I agreed on at least one thing. Absolutely, St. Paul. If Jesus' resurrection is not the real deal, the entirety of the Christian artifice comes crashing down. So yes, you better believe it, in this video I'm going to attack and debunk Jesus' resurrection. Stick around and we'll get into that right after this.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hello everybody, Magic Skeptic here, aka Magic Dara, and you're all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. I want to start right off the bat here and tell you that this video is very strange for me. This feels like a coming of age of sorts. Don't get me wrong, I've, over the past couple of years of uploading to this channel, become very comfortable with this mode of discourse, making videos, reacting to videos and discussing philosophy and theology and what have you. And one of the things I've enjoyed most is interacting with you guys in the midst of that entire process. So why do I think this video is a coming of age video? What makes this video so different? The thing that makes this video so different for me is the target, guys. I'm about to take down, or at least attempt to take down, the ideas of none other than Lee Strobel, who is a very popular and very successful Christian apologist. If you haven't encountered the word apologist before, you might be quite new to my channel. Christian apologetics is the domain of discourse that's charged with defending Christianity against its critics. That's what apologetics is all about, right? You'll also have Islamic apologetics, Jewish apologetics, and what have you. Basically, speakers or supporters of a particular faith who spend their lives dealing with the objections to that faith. So for Christians and for people like Lee Strobel, it's all about resisting the arguments of people such as myself, the so-called new atheists, right? A phrase that's never quite made sense to me, but perhaps we can discuss that in another video. Just to put a pin in that, it seems the only thing that's new about the new atheists compared to so-called old atheists is that new atheists aren't willing to just shut up, sit down, and be quiet. That acknowledged, Lee Strobel is of particular importance to me because Lee Strobel is arguably responsible for, single-handedly in some sense, responsible for making me a creationist back in the day. You see, guys, as you know, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, I received a Catholic upbringing. And it's not to say that that Catholic upbringing was enforced in my home. My parents were religious, but we didn't talk about religion. I mean, if you are familiar with communion and confirmation, I made my communion and confirmation. In other words, I went through religious rituals that welcomed me into the Catholic Church and then confirmed my, membership of that church. And so, yeah, I went through those religious processes as a child. They are kind of, speaking of coming of age videos, those are kind of coming of age moments for any young person who's a Catholic in Ireland, which is to say most young people, right? So I had that in my upbringing. I was raised Catholic, but my Catholicism was really enforced in school. And I've made videos on that in the past as well, and how disgusting it is for the Irish education system, a system which continues to engage in said behaviour, by the way, for how disgusting it is for such an education system to indoctrinate children into a Christian worldview and teach them about hell and encourage them to be good Christians and teach them how to pray and what have you. So yeah, I was raised a Catholic, but I wouldn't have described myself as a creationist at that point in time, not least because I didn't know that terminology. But as I got older, I became a creationist. And remember, a creationist is not someone who simply just believes that God created the world. That's just any Christian, really. Creationism is a unique I dare say, fundamentalist brand of Christianity, which deals in biblical inerrancy, the idea that the Bible is right on every conceivable matter, that there are no flaws to be found. So in other words, creationists will bite the bullet on the Adam and Eve narrative and accept that Adam and Eve are real people. They'll accept that the world was actually created in 6 24-hour periods and God rested on the seventh, etc. So I became I won't say I accepted every creationist view, but I wasn't a young earth creationist, for example. I didn't necessarily believe that the earth was 10,000 years old. I might have been agnostic on the proposition, which is bad enough. But yeah, I just wanted to make clear that I didn't just take every point of view, hook, line, and sinker, and believe you and me. That's not a defense. What I believed, the sample of beliefs that I did accept, were still ridiculous. But yeah, the person who was arguably responsible for me entering that domain was none other than Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel is an incredibly charismatic and persuasive speaker, and he really was formative for me. I watched numerous videos of his. I would watch them on repeat. I rehearsed and learned off his arguments, and I would use them against friends and family to convince them of my creationist worldview, that, maybe God really did create the world in 6 days. And, I'm not saying necessarily that Lee Strobel is a creationist. I just want to make that clear. I'll leave you make up your own mind about how you want to label Lee Strobel. I just want to kind of explain that he was kind of my stepping stone towards believing Christianity on a more fundamental level. He was my, entrance drug, if you will. And as soon as you see the following clip, you'll understand why. Again, Lee Strobel is an incredibly charismatic and persuasive speaker. It's only through a lot of study, effort, and reflection that I came in time to realize that the arguments of people like Lee Strobel are actually utterly flawed and fallacious, and nowhere is that more transparent than in the following video that I'm going to critique. So again, coming full circle with this little introduction here, why is this a coming of age video? Because I'm about to attempt to take down and critique and debunk the ideas of someone who I considered to be something of a role model of mine. I was his Padawan, right? At least that's how I saw it. I was his squire in training, and he was the knight. And so it is rather profound for me to sit here today and be where I am in terms of my atheism, and be where I am in terms of this channel. And thinking now about critiquing this video actually makes me feel a profound sense of, I dare say, accomplishment. I'm proud that I've come this far. And I hope, dear listener, that you get something out of my critique of this video of Lee Strobel's. And hopefully, or at least one hope that I have for this video, is that my critique of Mr. Strobel's video here will help other young people, or, someone of any age, really, escape the clutches of this sophistry. Because as well-meaning as Lee Strobel might be, and he's a genuine believer if you want to know my honest view, I'm not claiming to know his mind, but I do sense that he's a genuine Christian. He really believes what he's preaching. I don't think he's doing this for profit, albeit he's probably made a pretty penny, but I don't think profit is his central motive. I think he really believes what he preaches, and so he is the genuine article. But yeah, I do want to take down his arguments. I do think there's an immense amount of sophistry in there, conscious or unconscious. And like I said, I hope that my critique of this will help others to escape the clutches of such fallacious reasoning. And so without further ado, I give you Lee Strobel.
I like to look at the evidence for the resurrection in 4 categories. The first one is, did Jesus die on the cross? Was he dead? Virtually every scholar on planet Earth concedes that Jesus was dead after crucifixion.
Oh, Mr. Strobel, I'm afraid we're already in very hot water indeed. Really? Virtually every scholar agrees that when Jesus was crucified, he was dead? Wouldn't that presuppose that virtually every scholar agrees that Jesus was a real being? And that's not the case, Mr. Strobel, and I think you know that to be the case. So I've just pulled up a list here. The position I'm referring to here is known as the mythicist position. These are people who don't actually believe that Jesus ever existed at all. Now, just to be clear, dear listener, I'm not claiming that that's the position I hold. To be quite honest, I'm actually happy to agree to the idea that Jesus was in fact a real person. That just, for me, evidently doesn't shed any light on whether or not he really was a miracle worker, the Son of God, and what have you. I'm happy to accept that there was a guy called Jesus Christ bumbling around the desert 2,000 years ago, but again, that doesn't move my needle at all. New York is real, that doesn't mean Spider-Man is, right? So, just to address the specific claim that Mr. Strobel makes, which is that virtually every scholar agrees that when Jesus was crucified, he died. Well, here's a list of counterpoints. So, here are some mythicists for you to chew on, dear listener, if you want to look them up in your spare time. So, we have Dan Barker, Albert Bayet, Gustav Adolf Vandenberg I can't read that name. I'll probably put this list on the screen. Gerard Boland, Emilio Bossi, George Bandes, Thomas L. Brodie, Richard Carlyle, Edward Carpenter, Richard Carrier,
2 hours later,
Peter Gandy, Marshall Gauvin, Gilbert T. Sadler, Kersey Graves, Edward Greenlee. Let's scroll down through this list even further, all the way down to the Orr surnames. Solomon Reinach, Samuel Maximilian Reiser, Jonathan M. Roberts, etc., etc. I can keep going. Again, I'll put a quick list on the screen, but a quick Google reveals that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of scholars who are self-professed proponents of the mythicist position, people who believe that Christ never even existed at all. So, Mr. Strobel, when you argue and when you suggest that virtually every scholar agrees that Jesus was crucified and died on the cross, you're just being disingenuous. Now, I'm happy for anyone to suggest that those mythicists are wrong. I myself have already admitted and acknowledged that I'm happy to actually agree to the idea that Jesus was a real person. I just don't believe personally that that moves the needle at all in terms of whether or not he was the Son of God and whether or not his miracles were real and what have you. It could be the case that Jesus was a real person and that these are just very tall tales that surrounded him. People just invented stories about him. It could also be the case that Jesus was a deceiver, that he was some kind of a manipulator and dishonest person who convinced people. Oh, wow. I thought the police were coming to arrest me for making fun of Jesus right then. Oh my God, how brilliant would that be? Apologies about that interruption, guys. I'm assuming you heard that siren. It was very, very loud. If you didn't, you might just think I'm a madman right now. But yeah, a siren just passed outside the window. Oh, the joys of being a YouTuber. But anyway, coming back to the point. Lee Strobel alleging that all scholars, or virtually all scholars, agree that Jesus was crucified and killed. That's just bullshit. I'm sorry. It is just bullshit. And with that bullshit acknowledged, let's move on.
We have no record of anyone anywhere ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion.
Yeah, a full Roman crucifixion isn't survivable. Emphasis there on the word full. Thanks, Captain Obvious.
Even the Journal of the American Medical Association published a peer-reviewed scientific medical study of the evidence for the death of Jesus and said clearly the weight of the evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted.
I haven't looked into this study he's referring to, and, you know, if you want to look into it, dear listener, please do. But I sense that there's a little bit of sophistry going on here. If all he means here is that this medical journal read the narrative of the wounds that were inflicted and concluded that if said wounds were inflicted to a human body, the result would almost certainly be death, well then, yeah, sure, I agree. But I'm very doubtful of the idea that any medical journal has actually looked at the evidence for a historical Christ and concluded that a historical Christ is a real thing. That's not something that medical journals do. Again, I suspect what he's referring to here is that the medical journal studied the actual claims about the wounds themselves and created a taxonomy of those wounds and hypothesized about the impact that they'd have on the human body and came to the conclusion that said wounds would result in death. And yes, again, that wouldn't surprise me at all. I'm pretty sure you don't need a medical journal to conclude that brutalizing someone in the way that the Passion narrative suggests Jesus was. I'm pretty sure it's not a very controversial claim to say that said treatment of a human body would result inevitably in death. So again, I'm going to say thanks, Captain Obvious. But again, if I've misunderstood this study, and there is in fact a medical journal out there claiming that Jesus was a historical figure who sustained these injuries, that would just shock me beyond belief. But yeah, I do suspect that what's going on here is that the medical journal merely spoke about the nature of the wounds and what that would result in if they were actually, done to a real person. But that says nothing about whether or not Jesus was in fact a real person. But yeah, I hope that point is clear. And with that acknowledged, let's continue. Well, fuck me. Consider me shocked beyond belief. Because despite that diatribe that I just vomited out there, it turns out this study is real. It turns out Lee Strobel wasn't kidding. It turns out there is an article from 1986. From 1986 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. JAMA, J-A-M-A. This is crazy, right? So I found an article about it, and it's just, this is nuts. So this comes from the Washington Post, which says, the title of this Washington Post article, which I'll include in the description, it says, medical journal harshly criticized for article theorizing about Jesus's death. This was written by Don Colburn, and it's dated May 28th, 1986. So that's interesting because Lee Strobel confidently presents this article or this scientific study as some kind of, robust finding. He presents it as almost that this is just an accepted science. He doesn't at all mention, even for a second, that this is the subject of immense controversy. And oh boy, did this article create a storm, that this study, I'm hesitant to call it a study, and you'll understand why in a moment. I don't want to be perceived as that guy who's like, oh, I've just chosen the science I'm going to agree with. I agree with these studies and not those studies. But guys, not all studies are created equal. There are studies that are junk. I've gone through certain studies in the past on this channel that are undoubtedly junk. In my podcast episode about the soul, I detailed the so-called study carried out by none other than Duncan McDougall. Yes, that's his real name, where he tried to measure the weight of the soul. And that experiment is infamous in its ridiculousness. It's infamous in how flawed the methodology is, and this is why nobody takes it seriously, and which is why no one, scientifically speaking at least, has ever verified the existence of a soul. Not yet anyway. Maybe it'll happen, who knows, right? But yeah, not all studies are created equal, and listen to this. So again, now I'm not reading from the study here. I'm about to read from the Washington Post article from 1986. And it says, the article, or study, by a Methodist pastor and a pathologist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Min, purported to show that Jesus probably died from shock due to blood loss and inability to breathe on the cross. It relied heavily on gospel accounts in the Bible's New Testament. Now you ask yourself, dear listener, is this study, so-called study, or rather, does this study sound very scientific? Come on! You might as well have said, based on my reading of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, I have concluded scientifically that the basilisk was killed by Harry Potter. I mean, are you joking? Oh, Mr. Strobel. I mean, I was shocked. I Googled it. I mean, I had a sneaking suspicion that I better Google it, and I do like to be thorough for you guys. So I went and I Googled it just to make sure that I had the right answer. But I was wrong. Admittedly, I'm recording this section of the video later than the first section. Admittedly, I was mistaken. I hypothesized in the dialogue you just heard, not dialogue, in the monologue you just heard, I hypothesized that whatever this study was, perhaps Lee Strobel was misrepresenting it. Perhaps what the study was seeking to show is that if somebody had received these wounds, that they would have probably died. But no, this study actually purports to provide evidence for the historical Jesus and his death on the cross. but it was carried out by none other than a Methodist pastor. And it was based heavily on gospel accounts in the Bible's New Testament. But look, I'll keep reading. The article provoked a blizzard of letters, some of them congratulatory, no doubt the Christian bunch, most of them outraged, and all of them apparently surprised, no shit, to see such an article in a scientific journal like the Journal of the American Medical Association. Yeah, of course. That would be like opening up the Journal of the American Medical Association and finding articles about, again, Harry Potter, where to buy your magic wand. Make sure you check out Ollivander's. I mean, Jesus Christ. Forgive the pun. But yeah, I've highlighted a couple of sections of the article. Again, I'll link this article in the description below if you're interested in exploring it any further. But here's some quotes. These were some of the letters that were sent to the journal after publishing this completely ridiculous anti-scientific article. So here's a sample. Things must be slow at the Mayo Clinic, wrote Dr. Norman A. Marcus of Springfield, VA. He called the article thinly veiled anti-Semitism at its worst, and said it brings new meaning to the pseudoscience of forensic mythology. Let's look at another one. How did an unscientific study portraying a strictly unilateral Christian interpretation of the poorly documented death of a Jew who lived 2,000 years ago become clothed in the garb of scientifically acceptable fact and illustrated by highly imaginative and emotionally inflammatory illustrations? Asked 10 physicians jointly in a letter. So these 10 physicians wrote a letter and kind of together universally signed their name to it, thereby signifying their assent to this message. So obviously they were outraged by this alleged scientific article as well, right? Dennis Smith, a biblical scholar no less, from Oklahoma State University, called it a disgrace to your credibility as a journal of scientific inquiry, basing medical analysis on an uncritical reading of the Gospels, he said, is roughly equivalent to a paleontologist using a literal reading of the Genesis creation story as primary data for the origin of humanity. Absolutely hitting the nail on the head there, Mr. Dennis Smith. Well done. As a fellow editor of another American Medical Association publication, I am thoroughly embarrassed, wrote Dr. Joel S. Glazer from the University of Miami School of Medicine. At best, this piece is religious sophistry. At worst, it is a scurrilous polemic. Wow. 2 members of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations said that they were astonished that members of this journal would venture beyond medicine into theology. It is about as appropriate as if we used our magazine, Reform Judaism, to have our rabbis instruct our readers in the technique of open heart surgery. Oh, fucking hell. I love it. That's the best comment. I'm leaving it there. That is the best comment in the article. A Reform Judaism magazine instructing surgeons on how to do open heart surgery. I fucking love it. Is that not exactly what this is? A medical journal lecturing scientifically educated, PhD holding medical scholars, many of whom have decades of experience in the field, lecturing them about the mythological story of Jesus Christ and how he may or may not have died or allegedly was killed and what have you. I mean, this is just absolutely unbelievable. And again, Lee Strobel presents this as though it's kind of like a settled science. At no point does he even allude to or even hint at the idea that this article, that this alleged study, if you want to call it that, was met with unbelievable pushback. that various medical professionals, it seems like dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of medical professionals are coming forward here and announcing that this is absolute garbage, that this is hogwash. But look, let's extend an olive branch here. Let's extend an olive branch. It is possible that Lee Strobel is referring to a different study when he says that Jesus' death has been verified by a medical journal. It is possible. Now, that said, guys, I did Google rather thoroughly about Jesus' death and medical journals and all the rest of it. And the only result I could find, now, it doesn't mean that there isn't another one there. I'm not committing a black swan fallacy, which would be the equivalent of saying that because I couldn't find something that it's not there, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I couldn't find another medical journal that spoke about Jesus' death in this way. The only one I could find is this one from 1986, and I think it's safe to say that we can dismiss this one. This is absolute garbage, and if you want to know my honest opinion, I think this is the one Lee Strobel is talking about. It kind of... how he describes it and the contents of this article, it seems to hit the bullseye. I'd be surprised if he's referring to another one. And this one, it seems, has been dismissed as junk science by those who are subscribed to that journal or were subscribed to that journal in 1986. And I don't blame them. I understand exactly why this was dismissed. This is a fucking joke. But again, let me extend one final olive branch. Lee Strobel, in referring to this, I mean, maybe this isn't an olive branch. The olive branch is he's misunderstood this. That there has to be some kind of a misunderstanding at play in his thinking, right? Because the only other alternative I'm left with is the assumption that Lee Strobel is either a liar because he knows this is junk and has shared it anyway, or he's an idiot and is convinced by it. He's convinced by an alleged medical publication which was published by none other than a Methodist pastor. A Methodist pastor who based the research and findings in this journal on biblical accounts. Right? But of course, leave it to a Christian to form certain conclusions based on the Bible, and I guess I should expect no more from a person like Lee Strobel. But look, guys, if you interpret this article as anything other than sophistry and unscientific fallacious garbage, then unfortunately I don't know what to say to you. Get your head examined.
Even the atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann says historically it's indisputable that Jesus was dead. So Jesus was dead.
Oh my God! An atheist said that Jesus was real and that he really died? I guess I have to change my mind then. Do you see how weak these arguments are? This is kind of like, I don't know, when people say, oh, of course I'm right because Albert Einstein agrees with me. It's a really strange, almost like variation of the argument from authority fallacy. It seems here that, and this is again why I was so persuaded, I'm ashamed to say, by Lee Strobel's arguments when I was a younger man. It's because he really gets you where you live. When you're a younger person, or if you're not very well philosophically trained, an argument like that can be quite persuasive. Oh, you mean atheists believe this? Oh, well, maybe I should as well. But that's a nonsense. Atheists believe all sorts of ridiculous crap. I speak with atheists all the time, and you wouldn't believe the nonsense that they come out with. I've read research that suggests that atheists are not, in fact, very skeptical at all, that many atheists here in the UK, there was one study, which I can pop the link for in the description below, but there are many atheists who, after abandoning their faith, just adopt another supernatural woo. They become practitioners of, I don't know, psychic mediumship, and they get lost in the world of star signs and angels and energy and crystals and chakras. So they just swap their religion for New Age woo. That to me is not evidence of skepticism. That to me is not evidence of sincere rationality. I don't respect the intellect or the intellectual integrity of those people, I'm afraid to say. Call me an asshole for saying so, but I'm just going to be honest. What good is this channel if I don't just relay my honest sentiments in each and every moment? And my honest sentiment on this question is, atheists who stop believing in God and take up chakra healing and crystals and New Age woo on the side are not people whose intellect I respect. I don't think that they're true skeptics. They're not really following the evidence where it leads. And I'm guessing, dear listener, that if we were to press said atheists on the reason for them renouncing their faith, they might actually have fallacious reasons for abandoning their faith. And so, while I think they're incidentally correct in regard to their atheism, because I don't think there is good reason to believe in God, the way they got there might actually be fallacious and erroneous anyway. You see, guys, someone can accidentally have the right answer. Somebody can accidentally be correct. If somebody was to roll a dice right now, or roll a pair of dice rather, and I guessed number 11, and that's the number that was showing when the dice were revealed, that wouldn't mean that I was in tune with some kind of rational process that allowed me to determine the number. In that case, it's evidently just guesswork. I was just lucky if I got the number correct. And the same can happen with arguments. We can believe the right thing for the wrong reasons, and we need to be extremely careful of that, because if we got to the right answer through the wrong path, that means if we use that path again, we might end up at the wrong answer next time on a different question. And so this is why skepticism and good epistemological standards are so important. So no, I don't care if there are atheists who think that Jesus really did die on the cross. That doesn't move my needle at all. What I care about is their reasons. And when Mr. Strobel appeals to the fact that atheists agree with him on various questions, he's just demonstrating that he is one among many people who use irrational pathways to get to what they perceive as the truth. And in this case, I'm not convinced he has the truth. But look, let's keep going.
The second category of evidence is the early accounts we have for the resurrection. In other words, I used to think as an atheist that the resurrection was a legend, and that took a long time to develop in the ancient world. But what I learned is that we have preserved for us a creed of the earliest Christian church, a creed that is an eyewitness-based report of the resurrection of Jesus.
He's got eyewitnesses. Must be onto something. Let's look into this.
Now, this creed has been dated back by scholars to within months of the death of Jesus. Within months. That is historical gold. So we've got a news flash from ancient history on the resurrection.
Oh my God. You mean months after Jesus' resurrection, people said that it happened? Well, fuck me. I best get down onto my knees and accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior. You mean Iron Age shepherds, months after an alleged event, believed that it happened? Christ above, that is the most convincing evidence I've ever encountered for any claim ever. Are you fucking kidding me? Guys, I hope none of you tuned into this video to see if there's any compelling evidence for the resurrection, because as you're learning slowly but surely, that's not the case. Eyewitness statements, we don't even accept those today. And you want me to buy the eyewitness statements of Iron Age shepherds from 2,000 years ago? Are you joking? Are you fucking joking? This is nonsense. So people from 2,000 years ago said in written accounts, yeah, that guy Jesus, I think he resurrected. So now you believe it, Mr. Strobel. Mr. Strobel, why don't you wear your faith on your sleeve and just admit that the reason you believe in God is because of emotion, because you don't want to die, because when death comes, you want to believe that you see your loved ones and again, and that your life isn't just over and you don't just return to the darkness for eternity. Why don't you just wear your emotional reasoning on your sleeve? Stop pretending that you're a scientist or something. Stop pretending that you've got good epistemological standards. Eyewitness testimony? Are you fucking kidding me? This is a joke, guys. Eyewitness testimony. If you're going to use eyewitness testimony as a standard of evidence for the resurrection, well, I've got news for you, Mr. Strobel, but then you're going to have to accept an enormous amount of garbage in your worldview. There's eyewitness testimony for the existence of the abominable snowman, for fuck's sake. There's eyewitness testimony for aliens abducting people. There's eyewitness testimony for other religions that you don't believe in. Have you heard of Sati Sai Baba, the Indian guru who's believed to be a miracle worker? There are millions of people in India right now who will testify to having witnessed his miracles, and yet I don't see you embracing the Trimurti, Mr. Strobel. You gotta stop. This is nonsense. Eyewitness testimony is garbage. The human eye is not a camera. We are completely fallible creatures. We get things wrong all the time. And even if we didn't, even if our eyes were perfect imaging capturing technology, even if that were the case, we still couldn't trust this. We still couldn't trust this because we couldn't rule out somebody lying, we couldn't rule out somebody hallucinating or suffering from something like temporal lobe epilepsy, or somebody just wanting attention, etc., etc., etc. We also can't rule out in a narrative from 2,000 years ago, the whole phenomenon of whispers, where a story gets legs added to it over time and changes as it passes down through the centuries. What we have with the biblical narrative are texts without any original copies. We have translations of copies of translations of copies without any originals. And you want me to trust eyewitness testimony? Oh, I rest my case. Let's move on.
Third category of evidence is the empty tomb. And the best evidence for that is even the opponents of Jesus implicitly admitted the tomb was empty. Because when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the opponents said was, the disciples stole the body. Now they're conceding the tomb's empty, they're just trying to explain how it got empty.
Yeah, it sounds like those people who were disagreeing might have actually been skeptical in their thinking. An empty tomb doesn't mean, obviously he resurrected then. Isn't the body being stolen not an acceptable candidate explanation? I'm not saying we know that's the correct explanation, but it's certainly a candidate explanation. Surely you'd have to agree to that, Mr. Strobel.
So everybody's conceding the tomb was empty. How did it get empty is really the issue, and that goes to the fourth category of evidence, which is eyewitnesses.
Oh my God, and we're back to eyewitnesses. Okay, Mr. Strobel, lay it on me.
You know, for most of what we know about ancient history, it comes from one or maybe two sources of information. And yet, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Christ. That is an avalanche of historical data. So you put all that together and you have a really good case for Easter.
More like an avalanche of complete and utter bullshit and garbage. Oh my fucking God. Lee Strobel, you would not accept similar evidence for another religion's claims. You would not accept it. You believe this for emotional reasons. The tomb is empty, and you think the best candidate explanation is that the man himself came back from the dead and walked out of the fucking tomb. And your corroborating evidence here is that there are sources, both biblical and extra-biblical, that agree with said statement, that the tomb was empty, and so he must have risen from the dead. And added to this, the followers of Christ claim to have seen him after the fact, and you think you've got an avalanche of evidence to believe that the natural order was suspended. You think, given those few tidbits, that the natural order has been suspended and that an actual miracle has occurred. A dead human came back. A person defeated death. And your evidence for this is that some people claim to have seen him after the fact. Couldn't just be, the very well understood phenomenon of dead hallucination, when people are grieving and they see their dead loved one again because of some kind of Freudian wishful thinking. Couldn't be that, no? Couldn't be hallucination. Couldn't be someone who just looked like Jesus. Couldn't even be, let's imagine it was the same guy. Couldn't be that this person, their death was faked and the whole thing was a charade. Couldn't be that. No, it has to be that this person actually defeated death, all because people claimed to have seen him. Couldn't be that those people were lying or under a misapprehension. I think David Hume's logic on this really hits the nail on the head. What's more likely, that the natural order has been suspended in your favour, or you're under a misapprehension? Now, I'm not saying that they were under a misapprehension. I just think that out of those two options, the misapprehension option is the more likely one. I think that's quite irrefutable, frankly. But again, I'm not claiming to explain this. I'm not even claiming to believe that any of this ever happened. I'm not saying I'm a mythicist. I don't know if Jesus ever existed or not. I guess I'm agnostic on the proposition. For the sake of discussion, I often just accept that Jesus was a real person, because I don't think it's particularly integral to the discussion to acknowledge that he exists, or that he did exist as a real person. But this is not an avalanche of evidence. What you have is a story from 2,000 years ago, a story that you can't confirm is true, because this story was derived from translations of copies without any originals. What you have is eyewitness testimony, which you can't trust, because you don't know if these eyewitnesses were being honest, whether or not they were suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy or under some kind of a misapprehension. And it doesn't matter if those eyewitness testimonies are extra-biblical. I understand your desire to want to take those more seriously, because you might argue that they're not biased, but it's not clear to me that the mindset of people living 2,000 years ago was a repository of modern skepticism. People from 2,000 years ago believed lots of silly things, like the world being flat, for example, or that disease was a punishment from God because we didn't have a germ theory of disease and didn't understand the nature of viruses or epilepsies and what have you. You see, guys, I can't take this seriously. And even though, again, Mr. Strobel is the genuine article here, he really believes that Jesus came back from the dead and that he's our Lord and Savior, I just don't think he has good reason to believe it. He evidently thinks these are good reasons. I just think it's obvious that this reasoning is garbage. And coming full circle in this video, I have to say that this was incredibly profound indeed. You might have noticed that I was a bit more animated in this video, but it is rather exciting for me to come to this point in my life where I'm now critiquing the person who was largely responsible for my pathway into a more fundamentalist Christianity. Coming out the other end of that tunnel and dissecting Lee Strobel's arguments and seeing them for the sophistry and fallacious arguments that they are, it's incredibly satisfying indeed. And guys, I hope you found it satisfying as well. But let me ask you before we wrap here, what did you think of my critique? Do you agree with my assessment of Lee Strobel's arguments? Did I miss something? Do you think I could have done a better job critiquing a particular argument? Or perhaps we just agree altogether? Maybe you're on the religious side of this discussion and you agree with Mr. Strobel. And if you do, or if you agree with me, whatever your point of view, jump into the comments below, because the real meat and potatoes of this channel comes in the conversations that follow each upload. And I would relish another opportunity to have a conversation with you guys in the comments below. So if you have a thought or an idea or a challenge or whatever, a critique, whatever it is, jump into the comments below and let me know. And one last thing, guys, if you did like the video, do drop a like on it. That's extremely helpful. And if it is your first time visiting the channel, do consider hitting that subscribe button. And while you're at it, you might as well check the bell notification icon, because that way you'll be able to stay up to date with all of my videos on the channel, and you'll even be notified as and when my latest ones go live. So guys, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.